All right. It's actually the perfect place to stop because the very next thing we do is recite the Shema anyways. So we are going to do a couple pieces of liturgy here as we do each week. Actually have a slide at the very beginning. So we're going to have three different pieces that we recite for our guests that are here present or watching online. We have the Shema, as it's known. It's the Hebrew word for hear or understand, from Deuteronomy 6. We have the Matovu, and there's the references to that, and then the Mi Chamoka. All of these are prayers that have been said in congregations for thousands of years. We recite them in Hebrew, and then we also do it in English, so there's nothing that we do that's exclusively Hebrew for those that don't know it. So if everybody would please stand, we will start with the Shema in Hebrew, and then English. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod, Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Blessed be his name, whose glorious kingdom is forever. Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, Ve'ani barov chastecha avovetecha eshtachave el hekam kadshecha beiratecha. Oh, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your tabernacles, Israel. And in your great compassion I will come into your house. There I will bow, there I will fear your holiness, O Lord, O Lord. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar ba'kodesh, Nora tehilot, O sefele, O sefele. Who is like you, Adonai, among the gods? Who is like you, mighty in holiness? You are awesome in praise, doing wonders, O Lord, doing wonders, O Lord. Amen. All right, you can be seated. You can stay standing if you prefer, but I always give that one. Tithes and offerings. We do have a box back there on that table for anybody that carries physical monetary items anymore. I don't. I basically never have cash. I think I have $2 on me right now because I bought my son a yo-yo yesterday, and he had to pay for it, so I have $2 cash because of that. But we do have a bunch of different ways to give and contribute online on our website. Nobody here is salaried, so everybody donates their time. But there's also bills to pay. We've got to keep the lights on, for example, pay rent here. So we do have monetary needs for that. So anybody that feels so led, so directed, you can avail yourself of the box back there. There's also these little cards we got printed, little business cards for the fellowship that has more information on that on the back. All right, prayer request time, also praise time. I know that we do have quite a few out right now with various illnesses. The entire Young family is at home. Jeff called me earlier. So normally I'd be teaching today and he'd be up here doing this part. But Jeff called me earlier. His two sons had some sinus stuff, cough, sore throat, that sort of thing, most of the week. Tova seems to be okay, but the boys had it. And then he told me that this morning he and Farah got up and had sore throat and congestion and all that kind of junk. So they're at home for that. We are still also missing the Hannah ladies, so Jesse and both of their girls. Matt's here. Hi, Matt. But the rest of his family's still at home right now. Matt only shows up to help bless us with his talents, running the live stream and the soundboard and all that. I'm sure that's not the only reason, but anyway, so the Hannahs, they've had kind of round after round. Aviva had some stomach issues for quite some time, a couple weeks. And then after that, they were immediately hit with basically summer cold. So the runny noses and the fevers and all that sort of junk. And it's tiring and frustrating, no doubt. So prayers to both of those families that are not present today. Deb as well. So Deb's got back issues and stuff, still dealing with that. Yep, definitely prayers for Alan. I think it's all the ones I had right offhand. Anybody have anything? Yes.
My work just mandated the COVID vaccine to the level above me. Not me yet, but I feel that's next. So I'll have to make a career move or change. Not sure where I'll go, because it seems to be everywhere's guidance and direction on that. So.
Yeah, definitely. Guidance and direction, career direction for Chase, and also protection for where you're currently at right now for as long as you're going to continue to be there.
On the last stream, we have a request of prayer for Mary and her father.
For who? Mary? Her dad? Oh, that's right. I saw that the other day. Yeah. So a friend that at least a good portion of us here know, her father is very ill right now. As I recall, they were having issues even with I think it was his lungs, because he got put on a ventilator. So. Got some good news. Somebody got some good news. Somebody give me a praise. I like praises. Brian's got another one. Or I assume the live stream has one.
Katie, Angelo, strength for patience, peace, the rest, just always be strengthened. Mary dad probably has COVID with pneumonia. That's why he's in there.
COVID with pneumonia is Mary's dad. Oof.
And my girl here, praise.
Praise, yes.
And Alan and Don are here.
Yes. You did come back. So Tuesday Bible study didn't scare you off. Putting you on the spot apparently hasn't either. All right. Also for Maria, you notice Alan is flying solo today. Normally we would have Maria also playing guitar and gracing us with her vocal talents as well. She's had car trouble, suspension, struts. She says, every time I drive down my driveway, I hear this weird, kind of noise every time I hit a bump. Like, yeah, it's probably not supposed to do that. So her car's in the shop right now. She didn't have a ride for today. So prayers for her vehicle situation. Brian, too, I'll go ahead and throw you out there, too. Brian Brian's having some car mechanical issues as well. Of the almost worst sort in the month of July in Tennessee because the AC's not working. And that's just awful. So. Do what?
Eileen won her second appeal, so she gets to stay in rehab a little longer until she gets over that.
Good, yeah. Yeah, that's Alan's mom.
Almost 91.
Yeah, 90 years old, took a fall, had some issues, went through rehab, and then because of, I guess, paperwork and insurance and Medicare and all that, they're like, oh, you gotta go. And it's like, I'm not actually done yet. And on top of that, she developed pneumonia. Yeah, just, again, awful. There's been a lot of things going around the last few weeks. Anybody else notice that? It's been a lot, not just here. I mean, there's a very large fellowship down the road that's been hit very hard. They haven't even been able to have services the last couple of weeks because they've had 20 to 30, I think, people out ill. So, Brian's got another one.
Live stream, Jeff just said Hans Anderson got back in employment.
Oh, there's a praise for us. Yeah, Hans. So they met with us for a little while. They fellowship with this family of 7, I think. It's them, and they've got 5 kids. He had been deployed since basically December or January, I think. He's a Marine. Had been way overseas on the other side of the planet. And so he just got back home to his family. So there's a praise for us there. All right. All right. Somebody want to grab a tallit and we will bless the children? Yes. You going to bring it up? Come on. Well, thank you.
I'm here.
Don't worry about it. You're the 4-year-old, she's not. That's good. I'm handing it to you. Right in the corner there.
May the Lord protect and defend you. May the Lord preserve you from shame. May you come to be in Israel's shining age. May you be like wood pride on. May you be deserving of praise. Strengthen them, O Lord, and keep them from the stranger's ways. May God bless you and grant you long life. Lord, fulfill our Sabbath prayer for you. May God make you good husbands and wives, send you someone who will care for you. May the Lord protect and defend you. May the Lord preserve you from pain. Favor them, O Lord, with happiness and peace. Oh, hear our Sabbath prayer.
Father, we thank you for these children, for every single one of them. Again, Lord, for those that are here as well as those that are out right now. We ask that you would pour out your Spirit upon them, that you would bless them, Father, that you would be with us as parents, that we would train them up and dedicate them, Lord, to this way, that we would raise them in a way that would be honoring to you and would lead them in a life that continues to honor you, Father, and grow and walk in all your ways. May we instill in them a love of your Son, of your ways, Father, of your Torah. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, you can go now. You know there's a particular, I don't know, there's something got to be.
Oh, like a flag.
Yeah. Give the kids a moment to head back to Shabbat school. Yay! All right. We have a couple announcements, kind of a recurring announcement at this point. We have Bible study every Tuesday. We have had 1 week where we canceled it because we had people that were out of town, people that were ill, and so on. But in general, we have Bible study every Tuesday. We're currently going through the book of Acts. We are on chapter 3, almost halfway through chapter 3. So what we normally do is we read a section, a few verses at a time, and then we'll have kind of some guided discussion. We'll have a couple points of commentary, and then it's pretty much an open floor. So people that have something to share from their own studies, or as tends to happen, is questions. People have questions about things. As much as it is within the ability of those of us present to answer them, we do attempt to. Obviously, we won't have all the answers, but anyway, so yes, Bible study Tuesday at 6:30. We do tacos, so it's Taco Tuesday. It doesn't get better than Bible study and Taco Tuesday. We have, I think the largest one we've had has been, I don't know, we had 15 people maybe. But yeah, Tuesday, 6:30. We're not actually doing it in this building. We do it up at the other building. If you're going to come and visit with us. We do eat. We got a whole bunch of kids also, so we don't have an actual start time of the study itself. But usually everybody will start making their plates about 6:30. We'll eat. Usually that takes 30, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll spend a little while in the Word. The other announcement that we have is Sukkot. So we have Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles. We will be in Panama City. Yay! We will be there the 19th through the 29th of September. We have received word just this past week from a couple different people that have booked spaces down there. We're going to be at the Laguna Beach Christian Retreat Center. So it's a huge complex. They've got buildings that are dorm-style rooms. You could, it's bunk rooms where you could sleep 18 people. They've got houses that you can rent. They've got duplexes. They've got apartments. So a bunch of different options for anybody that wants to go down there with us. We did have, like I said, a couple this past week that mentioned that they would be joining us at least for a portion of the time that we're going to be down there. So we will have service on Shabbat. We will have meetings on the first day of Sukkot and the 8th day. So on the holy days, we will have meetings. Beyond that, we don't have anything nailed down yet other than a wonderful time of fellowship. Amen? All right. I'm going to try to bring up my sermon notes and control my slides for me at the same time. So you have to bear with me for a second. Let's see if it works. Hey, sort of. Close enough. All right. Shabbat Shalom, once again, everybody. It's good to see everybody today. To those watching online as well, even though I can't see you. So we'll start with a quick recap of the last couple weeks. We started a series, not last week, but the week before, on the divine council. Right? So in the first week, I spoke about God and the gods. Right, but gods in quotes there. God, the Hebrew word here is Elohim, is a reference to any sort of superhuman being. So the Lord himself, Elohim applies to him. Angels in the Bible are called Elohim in Hebrew as well. That's not the word for angel, but they are described as such. Even resurrected human dead, like in the book of Samuel, where the witch of Endor raises Samuel from the dead, it says, I see an Elohim coming out of the ground. Right? So the word is not so narrowly defined as to apply only to the Lord. We have to understand it applies to really any sort of superhuman sort of being. We looked at Psalm 82. It's a very short psalm. It's just 8 verses. Psalm 82, it says that God stands in the divine council, and in the midst of the gods, he judges. So God is judging the gods. Right? It's going to sound kind of odd to some. But the reason he's judging these gods, these spiritual beings, is because they were ruling unjustly. And so what were they ruling? And that was the nations, right? God said that he took Israel. Israel was his people, and the nations were turned over to the angels or the sons of God, the heavenly beings. We looked at Genesis 11, along with Deuteronomy 32, where God divided up the nations according to these heavenly beings. These are created beings that are not like God in that he alone has all power and is without beginning. So you think of angels. Are angels everywhere all at once? Are they all powerful? No. Right? God is without beginning. Angels were created. These other heavenly beings, if you will, have beginning. They too were created by the Almighty. So we covered all of that in the first week. We have that week's teaching is on YouTube, so if anybody's like, I have no idea what's going on, they can watch that one. Last week, Jeff spoke primarily on 2 different topics. So the first is, in theological circles, we call it the imago Dei, which is the Latin term for image of God. Right? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Does it mean, well, I have a head and 2 arms and 2 feet because God has a head, 2 arms and 2 feet? That's not how the ancient world saw that. That's not how the Hebrew people who wrote the Bible viewed the phrase image of God. The ancient world saw the terminology image of God as a reference to an appointed agent or representative. Right? And you find this even in ancient Mesopotamian literature, ancient pagan literature. You find references to the king being the image of the gods because he was supposedly their representative. It was often meant of a lesser god in the image of a greater god, or it referred to kings. And this is the common usage of the term during the time that Moses would have been writing this down in Genesis. Kings were considered to be the image of God, but only the rich and the powerful. So there is a subversive nature contained in the fact that Genesis 1 says all humanity was made to bear the image of God. He created the man and the woman in his image and gave them dominion over the earth. So in Eden, all humanity, not just the king, not just the high priest, all humanity was made in the image of God. And this is regal language. This is kingly language. Jeff covered some of that last week as well, talking about Psalm 8. David says that God made man a little lower than the angels, and yet crowned him, again, that kingly, regal language. So why did God make man in his image? It's a fair question. What purpose does man serve? And the short answer, as Dr. Heiser likes to put it, is that God desired an earthly family. He had created these heavenly beings, these angels, cherubim, seraphim, these sorts of references that we get to these divine beings, these spiritual heavenly beings. He'd created them, but he wanted an earthly family as well as a heavenly one. So last week, as I mentioned, Jeff covered Psalm 8. God made man a little lower than the angels. Some translations will say a little lower than the gods or the heavenly beings, but again, the point is the things that dwell in heaven, man was made a little lower than that. The second thing that Jeff spoke about last week was the nachash. Right? Nachash is the Hebrew word you find in Genesis 3 for serpent. the serpent in the garden. He talks about what this is actually a reference to, and the first little spoiler there is it's not a snake. It's not a snake. That's why nobody had to stop in the garden, and Eve didn't go, wait, you're a snake. How are you talking? Right? That wasn't the issue. It wasn't a snake. So last week, Jeff also covered passages from Job, from Ezekiel, from Revelation. Between the teaching from last week and the Q&A afterwards, we talked a lot about cherubim and seraphim, right? These different classes and distinctions of heavenly beings. Jeff also talked about the Leviathan, right? The twisting serpent, the great sea dragon, because Genesis says he made all the creatures in the sea, including the great sea beasts, right? Great sea monsters. All of that there is in the opening portion of Genesis. So quite simply put, what we saw in the serpent, right, was a divine rebellion. And Revelation speaks about this, and Jeff read that again last week. But that gets on to today's topic, which is divine rebellion, or really rebellions that occur with heavenly beings. Now, I will offer this because I got asked last week about some additional resources for this whole subject. There is one scholar in particular that's sort of very well known for this, is Michael Heiser. Dr. Heiser is an Old Testament and Hebrew scholar. He's got a book, multiple books, filled with references. The first book is called Unseen Realm. There's also a smaller, shorter version of it, a less academic version of it called Supernatural. And that covers a lot of this. It covers the divine council. And in fact, when I read through, and I've read both of them, when I read through them, I thought it covered this topic so well that I've actually been kind of taking his divisions within the book, and that's what this series has been ordered by, because it makes logical sense the way that he has structured it. The other resource that I would mention is there's a few videos by the Bible Project. If you've never heard of the Bible Project, fascinating, awesome stuff. I highly recommend it. You can find them on YouTube. They've got millions of views. Right? It's hard to imagine an animated cartoon-style video about the Bible with millions of views. That sounds crazy. But they're very, very well done. I've actually considered at one point playing some of them on the screen here, but then I figured that may get difficult for people watching online. And then we have issues with where's the sound coming in and all that. But again, if you want, look up the Bible Project. They have a playlist of 7 videos that are about spiritual beings. They're only 4, 5, 6 minutes long. They're very brief. There's one on angels. There's one on the adversary, right, Satan and demons. There's one on the divine council. So they cover all these different sorts of categories that we're going to be talking about at a very high level. But the thing that I found most impactful about them is the visualizations that they use, the way that they depict these spiritual beings influencing people in the earth. Right? And I can't really describe it, so you'll just have to go watch them. But again, these beings manipulating and kind of pulling the strings behind kings and rulers of the earth who commit such atrocities throughout human history, I think is a very great visual to have in mind as we go through this series. But anyway, so that's my rabbit trail for the day. Back to today's topic. I'll go ahead and inform everybody now, because without a doubt, if I just introduce a quote, somebody's going to have some sort of heart problems. I will refer to texts that are outside of the Bible. Now, I've already taught, and I did two-part teaching on Scripture. So if you've seen it, you know I have a very high view of Scripture and the books that we have in our Bibles. And simply put, I do not advocate for tearing that down and adding other books in. I don't advocate for throwing the Apocrypha in and all these additional extra-biblical books. They don't belong in the Bible, and there's a reason for that, but not what I'm going to go into today. For now, again, I will refer to some extra-biblical books today and in future coming weeks. I don't consider these to be things that belong in Scripture. However, there's 2 reasons primarily that I'll refer to them. The first is because they share a background and culture with the Hebrew people during the age from about the 3rd century BC to the 1st century, right? So 300s-ish BC to the time that the New Testament was being written. What we call the intertestamental period, the end of the prophets in the Old Testament before the writing of the New Testament, that few hundred years right there. There are some things that exist in that time period that were written to kind of fill in some gaps. The authors of these books have a shared common history and culture with the authors of Scripture. The second reason is that they provide additional insight into our studies of Scripture that help us understand some of the narratives and statements in the Bible. I use lexicons to look up word meanings that I don't know. I use dictionaries to get background information on a concept that I don't understand. So I use contemporary ancient Near Eastern texts, that's extra-biblical books from the time that the Bible itself was written, and works from that era to compare the language and words used in the Bible to describe certain concepts. Just like I mentioned with Jeff's teaching last week, the image of God is not a strictly biblical concept. Most ancient Near Eastern peoples throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, the Babylonians, for example, they had this concept of image of God. They believed in it too. So they had a concept in mind when they would be reading or hearing the phrase image of God or image of the gods, right? So they shared that sort of cultural context with the authors of the Bible. So we use that to help us understand, how did the Hebrew prophets, how did Moses understand this certain thing when he wrote it? How would his audience have read it? Now, in all of this, none of these things override the Bible. Right? So you have this statement from one of these extra-biblical books, and you have a contrary statement in the Bible. Well, the Bible is not going to be the loser here. Right? That gets into a much longer conversation about interpretation and hermeneutics that I'm not going to go into. But again, suffice it to say, I don't consider these Scripture. I do consider them useful. And I'll get to that when we get to those sources here in a moment. So with that in mind, let's continue. Now, Jeff read this verse last week from Revelation 12. It's actually 3 verses. So we'll start there. Revelation 12, 7 through 19. And hopefully it'll come up. Hey. And war broke out in heaven, Michael and his angels making war against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they were not strong enough, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. The serpent of old, it calls him, right? Again, Leviathan was described as a twisting serpent, the dragon. He was a heavenly being who was thrown out of heaven. And again, Jeff covered most of that last week. Passages from Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, right? We have this prophecy against the prince of Tyre. He's a guy that's in charge of the nation of Tyre. And there's a prophecy against the king of Tyre. And there's references made to him, such as he was in the garden of God, right? He was on the mountain of God. He walked amongst the stones of fire. Things like that obviously, quite obviously, this human ruler of the nation of Tyre does not fit the description for. So from such passages like this, from the prophets, we get a glimpse of this heavenly being, this dragon, as he's called. He exalted himself. He wanted to ascend above Adonai. In doing so, he led a rebellion in the garden. He deceived the woman into eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he was thrown to the earth, right? He lost his position in heaven. He was thrown to the earth as the prophets describe. These verses, as we begin piecing them together, paint a picture of rebellion. Not only did humanity rebel against God's commandments, in our case, the man and woman eating the fruit, but so did heavenly beings rebel. This rebellion is not the only one described in Genesis. We discussed a little bit in part 1 about Genesis 6, but if you recall, I said we'd get to that later. That's today. Today's later. So for starters, let's go to Genesis 6. We'll read verses 1 through 4. We are going to bounce around a little bit today, because we're going to go to Genesis 6 and then leave and then come back. It's going to be a whole thing. You have to forgive me. Or just not hold it against me. All right, Genesis 6, starting at verse 1. Now when humankind began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, then the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took for themselves wives, any they chose. Then Adonai said, My spirit will not remain with humankind forever, since they are flesh. So their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, whenever the sons of God came to the daughters of men and gave birth to them. Those, the Nephilim, were the mighty men of old, men of renown. I mentioned in part 1 that sons of God, or in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, is a phrase that refers to heavenly beings. We looked at references from scriptures, especially from Job, that show us that these created beings, these sons of God, these heavenly beings, are not simply humans. They were present in creation before God finished creating. So these heavenly beings took human wives and raised up children, and these children are called Nephilim. The heavenly beings are specifically called watchers in some texts. For example, in the extra-biblical book, see, that's why I offer my caveat. In the extra-biblical book of 1 Enoch, a book which is, at least a significant portion of it, predates the New Testament by about 300 years, we're told that watchers are the sons of God that descended in those days to take human wives. These watchers, as we call them, are also attested in Daniel. You can turn to Daniel 4 real quick. I'm going to give you a little background here while you do that. Daniel 4 starts off with Nebuchadnezzar, right? Because remember that Daniel is about, yes, Daniel. But while he's in exile in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges Adonai as the Most High. Note the very specific wording used in Daniel 4:1, or it could be the end of chapter 3, if you're using the Tree of Life version or Complete Jewish Bible. The numbering's different in those because they reflect a difference in the Hebrew Aramaic text. But anyway, so the end of chapter 3, or most likely the beginning of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar was writing a proclamation, and it says, "To all the peoples, nations, and languages who live in all the earth." Now, let me give you my opinion here. The terminology is very intentional. He didn't just say, "to all humankind." That'd be simple. All living things. Simple. He was very specific. To all peoples, nations, and languages. Right? This echoes what we've discussed before, specifically in Genesis 11. That is about the nations and boundaries of the people being set according to the sons of God. The peoples, simply the people themselves, the nations, that is their territories, where they dwell, and their language, which is their cultural and linguistic development. These three terms, people, nation, languages, describe not simply all of humanity, but humanity as dispersed by God at the Tower of Babel. So already here, in my opinion, there is a shadow, there's an echo of the sort of language just used to introduce this section. Now chapter 4 continues. We can go ahead and turn to verse 10, Daniel 4:10, or if you're using a CJB or TLV, it's going to be verse 7, I'm pretty sure. I'll say 10. "These are the visions in my head while I was on my bed. I looked, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and became strong, and its top reached to heaven. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Beneath it, the beasts of the field found shade, and birds of the sky lived in its branches, and from it all creatures were fed. I was watching the visions in my mind while on my bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven." He then goes on to relate the dream, and Daniel interprets it. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the first thing is this section is actually one of the only sections in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, that was not written in Hebrew. It's written in Aramaic. So, again, notice he says, "I was watching visions in my mind while on my bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven." He specifically calls it a holy one and says that it descended from heaven. These are three descriptions of heavenly beings. Holy one, watcher, from heaven. He's very explicit. Again, three terms to make sure you understand that this was a holy being from God. All right, so we'll continue now with the next verse. "He called loudly, saying, 'Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let beasts flee from under it, and birds from under its branches. Yet leave a stump with its roots in the earth, in fetters of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. Let him be damp with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the animals of the grass of the earth. Let his mind be altered from that of a man, and let an animal's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers." Right? This sentence is by the decree of the watchers, this verdict by the command of the holy ones, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the realm of man, and bestows it to whomever he wishes, and may set over them even the lowliest of men. I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw this dream. Now you, Belteshazzar," mind you, that's what the Babylonians called Daniel, "tell me its meaning, for none of the wise men of my kingdom are able to make known to me its interpretation. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, whose name is also Belteshazzar, was perplexed for a brief time. His thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belteshazzar, don't let the dream or the interpretation disturb you. But Belteshazzar replied, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree that you saw grow strong and large, whose top reached to heaven and that was visible to all the earth, whose leaves were beautiful and whose fruit was so abundant that there was food for all in it, and beneath which the beasts of the fields lived, and all the branches and lived, and in its branches birds of the sky dwelt. It is you, O king, for you have grown great and mighty. Your greatness reaches to heaven, and your authority extends to the end of the earth. You, O king, saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave a stump with its roots in the ground. In fetters of iron and bronze, in the grass of the field, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts, until 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is decree from the Most High that has come upon my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will dwell with the wild animals. You will feed on grass like an ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass over you until you know that the Most High is sovereign over the realm of mankind and gives it to whomever he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you as soon as you understand that heaven is sovereign. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Renounce your sins through righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps your prosperity will be prolonged. Verse 17. He says, this sentence is by decree of the watchers. We see Daniel again saying, you saw this from a watcher, a holy one sent from heaven. These watchers issued a decree and then brought that message to Nebuchadnezzar. This paints a picture for us, related both to passages here and to what we've already learned from Genesis, Deuteronomy, and the Psalms, that these watchers are divine council members. Now, this is where we step into some extra biblical literature to help fill in the blanks. But first, what have we already established from reading Scripture? Before we go outside of that to fill in the gaps, what have we already established? First is that God has a council. Again, Psalm 82, he stands in the divine council. He judges in the midst of the gods, right? So he has a council. That there are other heavenly beings. Again, very few people dispute that anyway. We say, yeah, we know there's angels, there's stuff up there, right? That these beings rule over the nations. Again, that's what he's judging them for. We could go back to Deuteronomy 32. He divided the nations according to these beings. That at least some of these beings are called watchers, right? And that the sons of God took human wives and had children that were called Nephilim. Now, I mentioned it a moment ago, but we have the book of 1 Enoch, right? It's an extra biblical text that predates the New Testament. In it, we have additional information in a story told about Enoch as a prophet and scribe of God. In that story, it says that 200 of these watchers, right, these heavenly beings, decided to make an oath with each other. They said that they would bind themselves by an oath to all descend together on Mount Hermon. Remember this. This will come up in a couple weeks. And that there they would take human wives. Not only does this book describe the fall of these watchers as they left their heavenly abode, these sons of God, and their taking of human women, it also describes that they began to teach mankind all sorts of wickedness. Magical incantations, drug sorcery, astrology, metallurgy, specifically making weapons of war. Quite simply, they taught mankind all sorts of wicked things, and all the wicked things that mankind already knew, the watchers taught them how to do yet still more of it. Men knew how to kill. We saw that with Cain and Abel. The watchers, according to 1 Enoch, taught them how to do it more efficiently. We learned in Genesis 6 that the offspring of these beings are called Nephilim. We see these again, Nephilim, in Numbers 13. The spies go into the land when Moses sends them to spy it out. They bring back, initially sounds pretty good. It's great. It truly is a land flowing with milk and honey. But then 10 of the 12 spies bring an evil report. Numbers 13:28, they say, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. Indeed, we saw there the descendants of Anak. Now, that probably doesn't mean much to most people. Like, I don't know who Anak is supposed to be. In verse 33, it says, we also saw there the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are of the Nephilim. That right there is the problem. Why did they see, well, we saw these Nephilim. Why did most Bibles say there are giants in the land? Because the Nephilim are giants. They're also elsewhere called Rephaim. These are all words, Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim. These are all words that you'll find, especially in the Torah and in the time of David. These are all descendants of these unions of watchers and humans, and they are giants. Now, there are also echoes of this in other ancient texts as well. There are ancient Mesopotamian texts, including many of them with a flood narrative. You've probably heard before that a lot of ancient peoples had a flood story, right? That is supporting what the Bible already tells us. So some of these Mesopotamian texts speak of beings called Apkallu. This is an Akkadian word, which basically means the same as sons of God. That is, they were believed to be divine beings, heavenly beings. Archaeologists have actually uncovered little hand-carved figurines of Apkallu that they used to bury inside the walls. They put them in little boxes with the word Matzareh on it, which in Akkadian means watcher. So imagine, they made these tiny little idols. They'd put them in a box, they'd write the word watcher on it, and then bury them in the walls around their cities and around their homes to ward off evil spirits. Now, again, this is just an ancient mythological legend, but of note, it does back up, right, what the Bible already seems to be describing. These other people that weren't even Hebrew people, but these other people also believed in these divine sons of God, these beings that were called watchers. And actually, there's a lot of material about the Apkallu that you can find that seems to say essentially the same things as some of these other things like the Book of Enoch. Now, First Enoch is not the only book to depict these events. There are echoes in it in what's called the Damascus document. That's a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls from about the 1st century BC, along with the Book of Jubilees, which is most likely a few decades older than that. We find it in some of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, which are books that date kind of from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. We find it in a rabbinic work called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is from the 8th or 9th century AD. But it has a very similar recounting. It says, angels descended and took human wives and raised up giant offspring. All of these texts relate the same basic facts about the story that we find in Genesis 6, and they range from a few hundred years before even the New Testament was written to nearly a millennia after. But now, going back to the biblical text, we do have a couple verses of why we can rest assured that our quotations and our sources from 1st Enoch are reliable, at least as they pertain to this event. 2 Peter 2:4 says, "For God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness held for judgment." Now, some Bibles will say Tartarus, because the word there is not the usual word for hell. It's not Gehenna. It's not Hades. Tartarus is, and that's another long mythological story. Basically, it was the holding place of fallen gods, the holding place of gods and titans in Greek mythology. But they shared this common idea. There's some sort of superhuman being that's being held in this place. And Peter, again, 2 Peter 2:4, refers to these. It says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, right, but cast them into hell. Jude, verses 5 and 7, says, "Now I want to remind you, though you know everything once and for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe." Verse 6, "And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper place, these he has kept in eternal restraints under darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these angels indulged in sexual perversion and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." Now, both of these passages from the New Testament are references to what we've just looked at from these extra-biblical books. This idea that angels fell, they did not keep their own domain. And what did they do when they fell? Now, Jude is talking about people doing wrongly, talking about humans, but he compares them to angels, right? He says, and since they, in the same way as these angels, these fallen beings, indulged in sexual perversion and went after strange flesh. So both of these passages from the New Testament reinforce the idea that the sin of Genesis 6 was the fall of the watchers and taking human women and bearing giant offspring. Both 2 Peter and Jude also say that God has delivered these beings over to darkness for judgment. Well, this too is told about in 1 Enoch. There we learn that because of their actions, God sent the archangels, like Michael, to round up the watchers and has bound them and held them in the earth where they await judgment. Yeshua says in Matthew 25, verse 41, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you accursed people, into the eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels.'" A fire has been prepared for these fallen beings, but they've not yet been cast into it. So knowing now what we do about the fall of the watchers in this event of Genesis 6 and the effect that it had on mankind, let's turn back to Genesis 6. I told you we'd bounce around a little. Back to Genesis 6. We read earlier about the sons of God taking wives and bearing the Nephilim. So what follows immediately in verse 5? Genesis 6:5. "Then Adonai saw that the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil all the time. So Adonai regretted that he made humankind on the earth, and his heart was deeply pained. So Adonai said, 'I will wipe out humankind whom I have created from the face of the ground, from humankind to livestock, crawling things, and the flying creatures of the sky, because I regret that I made them.'" Verse 8, "But Noah found favor." Many Bibles will say grace in Adonai's eyes. So in Genesis 6, verses 1 to 8, we have thematically sons of God taking human wives. God proclaiming that his spirit will not strive with man forever. The Nephilim were born to the sons of God and human women. The Nephilim were mighty. Wickedness increased. Every thought and intent of the hearts of man were corrupt. God resolved to destroy humanity. And lastly, Noah found favor. We then shift focus here in Genesis 6 to the ark and everything that follows after that. The building of the ark, the construction of it, the bringing and gathering of the animals. But it makes sense now why wickedness spread just so far and just so fast. So this first divine rebellion that we know of was the serpent, the enemy, rebelling against God, wanting to be God. The second, as we've just looked at in Genesis 6, the fall of the watchers, these divine heavenly beings rebelling against God. They wanted to create beings in their own image. The third was when they wanted to build their own mountain, right? This is the Tower of Babel. Biblical scholars in general will agree, and archaeologists the same, that what the Tower of Babel was supposed to be was a ziggurat. You ever seen that? One of the stair-stepped, almost like a pyramid. Why would they build them like that? Because those were man-made mountains. Because to the ancient man, the mountain was the seat of God. Moses went up to Sinai to receive the Torah. He would go up to the mountain to communicate with the gods. That's why in Greek mythology, the gods lived on Mount Olympus, right? The mountain dwellers were the heavenly beings. So building the Tower of Babel was not just, we want to have this really cool skyscraper. It was, we want to be gods, and this is our mountain in which we will dwell. Again, it was rebellion. Now, I've already said before over the last couple of weeks that we'll be getting into the New Testament portion and New Testament references in a future part. I'm trying to do this somewhat sequentially through the Bible. I'm also trying not to reiterate too much and rehash what I've already talked about. But we're just about done here for today. So I've been up here long enough, I think. I don't want to cover too many different topics. I actually had a secondary topic I was going to cover today, but then I thought that doesn't give people enough time to really chew on this one thing until next week, so I'm pushing that off for a week. But because it is related to what we've looked at today, and it is kind of a teaser for a future part, in the books I referenced earlier, 1 Enoch and Jubilees in particular, we learned something else about these Nephilim. Namely, that when they die, their spirits cannot return to God since they were not an authorized creation. That's what these books explicitly say. Humans were made to reproduce after our own kind. Dogs after their own kind, horses after their own kind, reptiles after theirs, and so on and so forth. But these Nephilim, these heaven-earth hybrid beings, were not authorized. Humans were made to be earth dwellers, heavenly beings, angels, and so on. They don't live on earth. They live in heaven. That's their abode. They were heaven dwellers. The Nephilim, however, were neither. As such, their spirits do not return to God who gave them. According to, again, these ancient books, the spirits of these dead beings wander the earth disembodied. And by the time we get to the New Testament, they're called demons. The malevolent spirits of dead Nephilim who seek to possess a body because they themselves no longer have one. But again, that's for a future part. Just when you're like, ooh, and then, no. But wait, there's more. So lastly, we can wrap up with why should I care, right? That's always a fair question. Why should I care about this? Why should you care about this? Well, first, it opens our eyes to some difficult biblical passages. I know for me, prior to a couple of years ago, in studying all of this material, I always had the lingering question, why do you see demons in multiple places in the New Testament? But you go to the Old Testament and you basically have one place. Well, two. One in Leviticus, one in Deuteronomy. You have Saul being tormented by an evil spirit, but it doesn't even call it a demon. You don't really see them. And then over here in the New Testament, there's a demon in this guy, there's a demon in this guy, there's a whole bunch of demons in this guy. Somebody's child is demon-possessed. Why do we have this thing here that we didn't see an image of in the Old Testament? So it begins to answer some of these questions. What are they? Where did they come from? It helps us understand what the biblical writers already took for granted. The Bible does not explicitly state where demons come from, for example. It assumes knowledge of such things. We read about Yeshua casting out a demon, but no one interrupts him and says, well, wait, where do these things come from? Right? They already had this knowledge. Reading from some of the material from their own time, we can find the answer to this question as supported from what the biblical writers do say. Again, if we take these extra bits and we fill in the gaps, does the rest of the Bible make more sense or less? Does it look contradictory, or does it begin to make the picture a little bit clearer? So that's kind of the first thing, is it informs our reading of Scripture. The second thing is it gives us hope, because we know that the cosmic battle, so to speak, right, our struggles against principalities and powers, right, is not new. It's not a new thing for there to be heavenly war, to be war between heavenly beings and those that have fallen. But we also know ultimately who has authority and who will win. All right, so recall again, if you will, that we can take some questions now, but if there is something that's going to be addressed in the future, I will defer to a future portion. So if anybody has questions, you can ask them now. Aaron, would you mind getting the wireless mic? It's right over there. Yep. I'll pass that around so I can hear and people in the live stream can hear. Is the handheld on?
What's that?
Is the handheld mic on? Is it on now?
How about now? Oh, yeah. There we go.
There we go. All right, so do we have any questions? I know Brian's going to have questions. Brian's also going to read live stream questions.
Yeah. There's the question of ghosts. People see ghosts. And what I believe they're these demonic entities impersonating the dead. So also there's a question of UFOs. I believe all these are demonic manifestations. So that's my feeling on it. So they're not aliens or technological, but they're all demonic entities. So
Yeah. I can't make a blanket statement on them. Hey, it's a weather balloon, or it's a drone, or these sorts of things. But in general, there are weird things. There are things out there that just simply aren't physical. And so I would say that they would pretty much have to be some sort of spiritual being. And again, we see in the Bible some things that spirits are capable of. We see, especially in the New Testament, what they're capable of. I would tend to agree. I think, along with the raising of Samuel and the witch of Endor and these sorts of events, they saw what looked like Samuel. She said, oh, this is an Elohim, this is a God coming out of the ground. If they could do it back then, I don't see why we would have to say, well, that can't happen, it's all made up, or, ghosts, or whatever. Ron?
I've always wondered through the years, how could, I'm going to say, a heavenly being copulate with a human woman? When I was taught years ago that angels don't have the capacity to reproduce. So is that because we're talking about sons of God, i.e. as watchers who have that capacity? And I don't see any angels raising families beyond that.
Yeah. So there's a number of theories as to that piece. There were some, I think it's even some of the church fathers that quote this. And that's one thing with the book of Enoch, too, is that the early church continued to use it for the first about 300 years. Tertullian argued for it to be included in the canon of the Bible. It wasn't until his deathbed that he said, well, I guess I was wrong because everybody else said no. But he was a huge fan of it. So this isn't just something that we suddenly rediscovered or whatever. But some of them had the theory, if you will, that they essentially, almost like demons possess, that angels, spiritual beings, possessed humans to do the deed of procreation. I don't see that. I don't see any references to that happening. It says that these beings left their former estate. Now, we do know that some angelic beings, because there's different kinds, right? A cherub is not a seraph, which is probably not the same as a watcher, but there could be some crossover. We don't really know what the extent there is. Some of them have 4 faces, and they look like crazy beasts, right? But we know that they can also appear as human. Now, we know that they can take some sort of physical form, at least some of them can, because some angelic beings came with God himself to eat with Abraham. He fed them, right? So there's obviously some sort of physical something that they can take on. The idea that angels don't procreate is in general based off of Yeshua's statement in the Gospels. It's one place where he says that, at the resurrection, they'll be like the angels of God, neither marrying nor giving in marriage and that sort of thing. I think that reference, first of all, I don't think he's making a reference to angelology. I don't think he's defining all heavenly beings based on his statement there. Because contextually, he's answering a question by the Sadducees, right? And they said, so we have this woman, and she's married, and he died, and she remarried, and he died, and so on, all the way up until she died. Well, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Well, you have to remember the Sadducees didn't believe in angels, and they didn't believe in the resurrection. So he answers their trick question with 2 trick answers based on things they don't even believe in. So I don't think he's making, like I said, a blanket statement about angelology defining what angels can and cannot do. I think he's much more within context. He's trying to, like he often did, answer their question with a question without, you know what I'm saying? As for the different types of angels, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Angel does not describe a being. Angel more describes a function. Right? Angel, as we call it, really just means messenger. That's it. In Hebrew and Greek, the word means messenger. So a messenger that God sends out, hey, go tell the king this, and we've gone over some of those examples before, would be called an angel just because he carried a message. But whatever these different types of beings are, it would seem the watchers, at the very least, were somehow capable. Like I said, maybe they can take on physical form. If they're capable of doing it to eat food with Abraham, I would assume they're capable of doing it in such a way to procreate. Does that answer the... Yeah. You may not still agree, but that's about the... So, I appreciate that.
It helped give me a little more clarity.
Good. As long as I'm offering more clarity than confusion, then I think I'm okay. Questions are great. Confusion, not so much.
Thank you, Hannity. He's good at this. We should get him to do this more often. Aaron, hand the mic.
Being voluntold.
Exactly. So I think the verse is angels in heaven. So it's referencing angels that are actually serving God, not the ones that fell. And also it might be like future tense, when you get to the kingdom, there will be no marrying and giving in marriage as a future event in that verse. But it says angels in heaven, I believe, in the verse. So
well, I would say that is a fair statement. Because like I said, the whole point with the Nephilim was you don't have a place, right? You were not an authorized creation. You were essentially a bastardized creation of these beings that left their estate, as Jude and Peter say. They left their estate. They lusted after strange flesh. Strange meaning not according to their own, right? Foreign. And that was human. And they weren't supposed to do it, but they did the thing. The other question is, if they didn't, and there are other theories here, we'll be transparent. There are other theories about Genesis 6, that the sons of God refers to righteous men, and the daughters of humanity, or daughters of mankind, refers to unrighteous women. That gets a little muddled. Sons of God, as we discussed in the first week from Job, is very clearly a reference to things before humankind was created. Because he's talking about when he's creating our creation, the sons of God rejoiced. We didn't exist yet. But there are other theories that this was, okay, well, this is, the line of Seth versus the line of Cain. So the women were from, evil women from the line of Cain and righteous men from the line of Seth. The problem, though, is how does normal human plus normal human equal giant? That's another problem. because that's not the way of things. Not everyone was a giant, right? But there clearly were giants. Goliath is a great example. The Anakim, right, the Nephilim. David actually had a band of merry giant slayers. Do you know that? There are stories in Samuel and I think it's 1st or 2nd Samuel, where
yeah, his brother killed a giant.
they went out and they basically went giant hunting. They talk about men that are really tall, men with 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot, all these sorts of things, right? These sort of genetic mutations is really how we would classify it scientifically, but would include giantism, these giant beings. So again, one of my contentions is if it's simply humans, how does normal human plus normal human equal this gibor, right? Giborim is a Hebrew word, mighty men, it says. And then the same thing about Nimrod, it says that he was a mighty man. And then this guy suddenly goes out and decides, I'm going to be God, sitting on my own mountain. And clearly that's also a problem.
So question-wise, mighty men, men of renown, would that not only imply giantism, because Malcolm Gladwell, for example, just assumes, oh, well, Goliath had giantism when he was half blind from the giantism, so like genetic mutation of giantism. So he'd be led out in the field because he couldn't see, and he had weak bones, and all this stuff was just a medical thing. But would men of renown cover things like people that were some kind of superpowers, seem to be like X-Men or superheroes, we'd say, like, or that was just purely they're very, very large? Or does this imply they had some kind of other powers going on, being half angel?
Yeah, so the word itself is kind of, so gibor, right, is what we're talking about. Giborim would be talking about the plural form of these people, or giborim. Givor really just means might, strength, power, great in stature or whatever. It has to be defined contextually. And so again, we know from various other references that a lot of times when this is used, it's talking about their large stature. We know that they had various sorts of what we call genetic mutations. You know, being 9 feet tall, that's a genetic mutation. That's not normal human stature. Having 6 fingers on each hand, that's a genetic mutation. Beyond that, I don't know. No references come to mind within what's close to the biblical corpus of writings. And obviously you have other Mesopotamian myths, but it's the same thing like Zeus. Was there really a Nephilim that could throw lightning bolts and they later called him Zeus? Probably not.
Or Storm from the X-Men, you know. Similar thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's common to the human experience to see these superhuman beings, right? Superheroes, we call them. It's common to human experience. We write stories about them. But ultimately, I think it's all centered on a core sort of original myth, if you will.
And my next question was about, I guess, spiritual liability. We know Paul talks about God at one time overlooked the ignorance of the nations. And if you were, say, in ancient Greece, you've never heard of Yeshua, you've never heard of Yahweh, you're just living like a pagan because you lived in Sparta in 300 BC, for example, or 500 BC. Are these people held liable for basically worshiping these fallen beings their entire life, even though they didn't know better? Or there was no other option, or this is all they knew, or they were deceived, and there comes a point when Yeshua comes and now they're responsible? Or how does that pan out soteriologically? Well,
so that actually touches onto a lot of different topics. That starts getting into exclusivism and restrictivism and all that. So I will try to keep it brief. Directly to the question at hand, people that are worshiping false gods, are you liable for that sin? Well, yes. I mean, any sin you commit, you're liable for. But there's a difference, at least there seems to be in the Torah's system of justice, for sins in ignorance versus sins in rebellion. You see Numbers 15, where he describes anyone that does any of these things unintentionally, you would offer your sacrifice, you would be cleansed, you'd say, okay, Lord, I'm sorry, you'd repent, you offer your offering, and you move on, and now you just don't do the thing. The next section, though, it says, but anyone who sins with a high hand, right, that's a symbol, it's an idiom for rebellion. It means you know what you're doing is wrong. You know God said don't do this. And so you say, you know what, I know you don't want me to do this. Not that with some sort of internal struggle, but that I will knowingly choose to rebel against you. He says, anyone doing that, it's death. And the very next story was the man gathering wood on the Sabbath and they stoned him. Right, why? Well, because you had just received the Sabbath command. You know for a fact you ain't supposed to be doing it. You didn't, oh, well, I didn't know we were supposed to be, resting on Shabbat. No, you know not to do it. And then you didn't. So you chose knowingly to rebel against the Creator. So the level of knowledge increases the level of responsibility. Like, they had just crossed the Red Sea. I mean, this guy had just walked through the Red Sea, and he picks up sticks, 10 minutes later. Not thousands of years later, it's
totally removed. The people that didn't personally witness all those miracles were less liable. Is that like Jesus talking about the towns he went to that rejected him after seeing the miracles would be more responsible than Sodom and Gomorrah? Or because they'd actually seen the miracles?
Yes, but again, it's not necessarily, it's hard to say more responsible. You're responsible for your actions, right? You have moral responsibility, you would say. If you sin, you're responsible for that sin. But again, there does seem to be a distinction in the Torah's system. There also seems to be that in Hebrews, because Hebrews makes mention of, if you go on sinning willfully, that is knowingly in rebellion, right? So there does seem to be these two different categories. It's still sin regardless, right? Stealing, taking something from someone else that doesn't belong to you, it's still sin. But there seems to be a different sort of consideration of, okay, well, this was wrong, now go make up for it, versus I did this because God said not to, and I want to rebel against him. There seems to be a different severity, I guess.
So Katie had a comment, she's our thread theologian, about the God overlooking their ignorance. She believes that's going to start in the kingdom when everyone knows the law, so they don't have to teach their neighbor because everyone knows. So then everyone would be in rebellion if they didn't do it because everybody would know.
Yeah, and to be clear, that's a statement from, is it Ezekiel or Jeremiah? One of the prophets, he says, no longer, in those days,
Yeah.
talking about the kingdom age, no longer
Ezekiel.
will a man teach his neighbor, know the Lord, for they will all know me from the least to the greatest. Right. Yeah, the new covenant, right? No longer is it written on tablets of stone, it's written on hearts of flesh. Not even hearts of stone. It's written on hearts of flesh. And then yes, if he has put his spirit and his word, if he has written his Torah on your heart, clearly you would already know him. So,
and Miss Jessie Hanna says a sacrifice is still required even if you unintentionally sinned. So
Yes.
there's still, once you find out, you're still responsible. There was no
Yes, and
completely
that's-
get out of jail free card for ignorance.
that's what we call the guilt offering or the trespass offerings. Leviticus 4 or 5, I think it's 5. It covers all the different reasons for that. And basically, it's you did something wrong, but you didn't know it. And so you just go about your day or whatever. But when you learn, hey, this thing that you did 3 weeks ago was wrong, you still have to go and make up for that.
Katie Angelo wants to know about the 120 years. Men still live longer than that. Afterwards, you and I discussed that with Jubilees and some other things before, but she wants to just know more about that.
Yeah, so normally that's interpreted to say that God is limiting the lifespan of humankind to 120 years. Right, and again, that's Genesis 6. He says, my spirit will not strive with man forever. And he says, for his days shall be 120 years. Well, then you track forward and you find like Jacob. Right, Jacob died, and this was hundreds of years after God says this. Jacob dies, and it says he was 136. Well, did he get extra time? Did God extend
Good
him for
behavior.
some special reason or whatever? I don't read Genesis 6 as saying that God is limiting the lifespan of humankind. I read it as saying he's decreed 120 years from right now, 120 years, and then the flood happens. So basically, it's a stopwatch for Noah to start building the ark once he calls him. So I think that 120-year span is that ark construction time period. I don't think it's man's lifespan.
We have about 5 votes for Jeff Young to be removed from the thread for this question.
We had 5 questions from Jeff?
No, we have 5 votes on to be removed from the thread. I have a question. Can God make a sandwich so big that he can't eat it?
I thought Daniel Kaplan asked that one, right, Jeff?
He's taking Daniel's spot as a...
Yeah. Can he, I have a really silly answer, and the philosophers hate it. Can he make a sandwich so big that he can't eat it? Yes. But then he could also eat it.
There you go.
How about that? It's like, can he make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Yeah. And then he could make himself lift it. So, it's not a problem. Why are these questions problems?
Jeff's hungry, apparently. Farrah needs to make him lunch.
Yeah. Can Jeff make a sandwich so big that Jeff can't eat it?
Doubtful.
That's what I want to know.
Don, did you have a question? Don had a question.
It's not exactly a question, but they cover it up with archaeology. Mostly in the 1800s, they found giant skeletons. So, but they send the remains to the Smithsonian that say they would cover it up, and because it did not fit their narrative of evolution. So, I thought that was interesting. Also, another comment on the UFOs is in the actual genuine encounters, they would try to abduct people, but if they could not do it if someone is a Christian, unless a Christian gave them permission. I thought that was an interesting point. So showing that these beings are spiritual, fallen beings. So that's all I got there.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things, paranormal, those sorts of things that makes everybody uncomfortable. There's clearly something else there. And so I have no doubt that just like anything else, that there's a mediating position. I don't think so many people across time, history, space, multiple different countries, hundreds of years apart, could describe supernatural experiences so similarly and have no influence on anybody else that had a very similar such experience. I'm sure that stuff gets hyped up and some of it's made up, and I'm sure that there's some stuff that really does happen. But yeah, and again, what we know, and this gets into a future part, but the whole thing with demons is, as we see them depicted in the New Testament, they want to possess. They want to be in some sort of host, if you will, some sort of physical thing. So there's obviously a drive for that.
So the Norman Doe's had two questions. One was about basically Noah being pure. Was that moral purity, genetic purity, or both? And then the follow-up question is, if they're all wiped out, why did Moses have to deal with them later? Was that the Nephilim on the earth in those days and afterwards? It's like, how did the afterwards come about? And was Noah genetically pure, or morally, or both? And then, why are we dealing with it later and still?
Yeah, so that comes up in the question of, in this area of study, it's typically called a second incursion. Or the first is when the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon, right? And then according to, again, these extra biblical sources we have, God rounded them up and bound them in hell, in Tartarus, and then sent the flood, and only Noah's family survived, so all these giants out here, they should all be dead, right? Why do they exist later? So again, there's competing theories, one of which is that while Noah being righteous, his sons being righteous, that some of his sons' wives essentially carried the same DNA, right? That would basically resurrect that line. Knowing where the giants end up, where the Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, where they end up by the time of the monarchical period of David and so on, which is Canaan, throughout the land of Canaan. So it's possible that Ham's line somehow preserved some of that. I think that's the best explanation of it that I've heard before. Of course, you have I think there's a rabbinic legend about there was one giant who hung on to the outside of the ark for the whole time that the world was flooded, and after the ark settled, then he got off, and that's how they. I don't really buy that one, but that's one theory. It'd be fun to see. And
Ham's line also produced Nimrod and Sodom and Gomorrah and Tyre, Sidon, a long lineage of bad cities mostly. And the Egyptians, the Pharaohs. Yep.
Yeah, Mitzrayim.
Babylon, Assyria, some of Assyria.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme here, right? All the really, really wicked people seem to come from there. And again, if it is any indicator, we do see that it's because of the sin of these Watchers that not only did sin happen, but wickedness proliferated. Right? Iniquity, not, that guy did something wrong, but absolute evil spread everywhere, to the extent that the entire population had to be wiped out. Right? All of humanity had to be affected by the flood.
This is probably good for an American audience, a Western audience, because we just hear the word sin, and that's just, to us, all-encompassing. But you had Kin, you had Avon, you had, unintentional sin, wickedness, rebellion, all these different words. Could you kind of go over that and explain the difference between the different Hebrew concepts of sin for everybody? Because different levels of judgment seem to take place with the Scriptures.
Yeah, so chata is the Hebrew word for sin. Interestingly enough, it's also the same word for sin offering. Right? It's chatat. It's an offering for sin is the word for sin. So you have sin literally means to miss the mark. That's what it is. If you're shooting at a target and you miss, you chata, you miss the mark. So you didn't reach the goal, that would be sin. There are other categories. You mentioned avon. It's not, I heard your southern accent, you called it Avon. People are starting talking about makeup.
It's that makeup.
See, I've heard that sermon before.
Yeah,
I've heard somebody preach a sermon.
Waiting to happen.
I've heard the sermon about makeup and how it's evil because Avon means iniquity.
I'm from the Southern Kingdom, just so you know.
Not making this up. I've heard that sermon before. It's terrible. Don't do that to
The
people.
Southern Kingdom of Tennessee.
Anyway, avon, so avon, avain, depending on what form it's in. Iniquity is much more than just, oh, well, you missed the mark, right? You did the thing, you kind of struggled, you did the thing you weren't supposed to, okay, we'll go make up for it. It's not that, right? Iniquity is much more of a intense sort of wickedness, right? There'd be some categories of things that we would say, brutal sins, sexual sins, those sorts of things that we would say, well, this is just wickedness. Child sacrifice. That's not just missing the mark. That's wickedness.
People did it because it's evil.
Right. And honestly, the best sort of breakdown, again, because you can see it visually, is that YouTube page I mentioned earlier, the Bible Project. They have word studies. Everybody does word studies. Most people don't, but they think they do. But they have one on these three words. They have the words for sin, the word for iniquity. There's one more. I think it's transgression. But they have the three different words, and they break it down. And again, visually, you can see and get a better picture of it. So I recommend those for that. There is, and there's, what is it, abomination. Right? So only certain things are actually considered detestable or abominable. Like that's not just oh, you did a thing I said not to do. Right? You did a thing that's completely disgusting. Right? There are different categories of this. And then there are some things, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, because if you're just reading through the Torah, if you're just reading through, again, Genesis to Deuteronomy, you say that certain things are classified as requiring a sin offering. Right? And then if you stop and ask, you go, but how is that a sin? Right? If you take a Nazirite vow, you can't eat things made from grapes, you can't drink wine, you can't cut your hair, those sorts of things. You can't come in contact with the dead. And it says even if he's out in the field and he's working and somebody near him dies and he comes into contact with him, he's broken his vow and he has to go offer a sin offering. Why? That's not his fault. What sin did he commit? Same thing when in Leviticus 12, when a woman has a baby. It says she goes and offers a sin offering. Well, having children's not a sin. God commanded, be fruitful and multiply. How can that require a sin offering? The point is, because sin offering, as we understand it, usually means offer of sacrifice because you committed a transgression against God's commandments. But that's not how it's actually understood in the Bible itself. Sin offering, the offerings for sin, are offerings for anything that causes separation. Right? When a child is born, there's an issue of blood, there's the issue of the time of recovery. You have, if it's male or female child, I think it's 40 to 80 days, depending on which one. That the woman couldn't go into the temple. Right? She didn't do anything wrong, but it says she has to offer a sin offering once her days of purification are complete. Well, it's because during that time period, there was separation. Right? She was separated from her ability to go to the temple. So because of the fallen world that we live in, it's a separation offering. It's the same thing as when the Nazirite who's taken a vow comes in contact with the dead. Well, now he's been separated from the presence of God. So he goes and offers a separation offering, a sin offering, because of that.
And all those things were things like pain in childbirth, death, all things because of the curse. They came in contact with. We'd say they came in contact with things that God didn't intend, or they came in contact with the consequences of the fall.
Yeah.
So last question before we let Jeff go make his sandwich. Katie, you want to know about the judging the angels again? I think we talked about it last week, but I'm not 1,000% certain.
Oh, about us judging angels? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, this I'm pretty sure was the question that I deferred to the future.
Oh, okay. So you deferred to this week.
Not there yet.
Asking again. Okay.
What's going to happen though?
Katie's anxiously waiting for it.
She's gonna keep asking this question, which is fine. I'm not upset about that. She's gonna keep asking the question though, so she doesn't forget. And then the week that I actually would be covering it, she's gonna forget.
And she also wanted to know about, could it be about the spilling of the blood, spilling of life?
About the what?
Could it, the question about the spilling of blood, I'm not sure if that's related to the angels part or if it's about the...
Oh, separation?
Separation because of spilling of blood, spilling of life. Would that be the blood being shed?
Yeah, I mean,
would that make you unclean, I guess?
Yeah,
if someone died in a field or if there's childbirth.
That would be, that would be related to it. Life is in the blood.
Childbearing.
I mean, these things where death is present, right, where blood is present, so the spilling of human blood, where death is present, those sorts of things are the things that cause separation. Even just a normal person coming into contact with the dead. The high priest wasn't allowed to come in contact with the dead. If you remember when he had 4 sons, 2 of them were struck down. God killed them for offering strange fire, it says. They had to get their cousins to come in and drag them out. He himself couldn't go in because he couldn't go near the dead. Because Aaron, as high priest, had to be separated from these things that would otherwise have separated him from the holy place. And him being the one going in and officiating there, he couldn't be caused to become
Do you think that's medical, like during a Black Death? You know, everybody made a pilgrimage to Rome. You go to Rome, the priest has plague, then the rest of the world gets plague because everybody from all the world goes to see the priest, and they go back home with the plague. Or is that like spirits jumping bodies, this kind of thing? Or is it just general principle? Like if you're a priest and around somebody that died, that person had a spirit, would that spirit, leave that person and try to inhabit somebody else?
I think it touches on a couple different things. I don't think the concern, by and large, is over, well, if there was a spirit in this body that might try to, possess me or something. I think the concern is more over death itself, because death is not allowed in God's presence. And again, we have the commandments throughout the Torah that pertain to the building of the tabernacle. All the different things you couldn't do near the tabernacle. There's commandments in Deuteronomy that tell you to get a shovel and go outside the camp to do your business, because you can't defile the place where God walks in the midst, right? His presence dwells in the midst of you. You can't be defiling. You can't be gross. You can't do things that would cause separation. Normal things throughout the course of life cause you to become unclean, quote unquote, right? Ritually unclean. You would go and you'd be cleansed and purified, and after the end of that day, then you would be covered. You'd be safe. But any of these things that cause separation, which does seem, at least in most cases, to be related to death. In fact, there's a book came out a couple years ago called Jesus and the Forces of Death by Matthew Thiessen. And he's talking about in the Gospels all the different places, and you wouldn't even notice some of them, but all the different places where Yeshua is encountering these forces of death, whether it's in the woman with the issue of blood, whether it's in people that have demons, people with other sort of physical ailments, and how he is inherently coming against their unclean state. Not just, he's healing their physical ailments, but he himself is inherently coming against their unclean status.
So it's restoring fellowship.
Restoring them, yeah.
To fellowship with God and man.
Yep.
So Jesse had a update on a prayer request, but so Katie's still asking about angels, judging angels, which we pushed it this week. And then Jesse said that Mary's dead, they called him the family, and things look grim. So he's not a believer, so everybody just keep that in prayer throughout the week. And I'll shut this off now.
Huh? Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm going to address the judging angels thing. I'm just not going to do it today. Yeah. Like I said, I'm going to defer that.
Oh, so you're deferring it to next week. I thought last week we said we're deferring it to this week. So you're
No, last week I deferred it to a future date. Today I'm deferring it to a yet still future date.
Sorry, Katie, I was confused.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I said. She's going to keep posting the question each week. I'm just going to keep deferring it.
All right, cool.
Not like to be rude, but yeah. No, so again, what I'm trying to do is get through things mostly chronologically, systematically, to lay a foundation. So we've been predominantly in Genesis thus far. We've been in Genesis 1, 2, 3. We've looked at creation, the fall. We've been in Genesis 6, right, the Watchers and their descent, the rise of the Nephilim. We've been in Genesis 11, which is the Tower of Babel. So trying to move almost chronologically. We'll get into the time of the kings soon. And then once we get through most of the Tanakh, most of the Old Testament and the references therein, we'll move into the New Testament. And that's where we'll deal with a lot more of the things about where Paul says, because of the angels, right? Woman covering her head because of the angels, about judging angels, about the various references to demonic forces and legion and those sorts of things. But yes, I don't think we'll be all the way to the New Testament next week, but within the next couple weeks, we'll do it. I'll just keep baiting everybody, and everybody has to come back and hear the rest of it that way. Okay, next Shabbat. It amazes me that still works. All right, so I'm going to do the Aaronic benediction. If you're not familiar with it, it's a prayer that in Numbers 6, Aaron, as the high priest during that time, would pronounce this blessing over the people of Israel. God told him, "You shall have Aaron bless the people in my name in this way." And this is how we close our service each week. Yivrechach Adonai vayishmerecha, Yair Adonai panav elecha vichunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha Ve'asim lecha shalom. May Adonai bless you and keep you. May Adonai make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Adonai lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. In the name of Yeshua, our Messiah, the Prince of Peace. Amen. Yep. Also, we will be heading up to the other building to eat. So if you're a guest with us, feel free to stay and eat and fellowship, etc.
Oh, yeah? I'm sure you're better at it than me. I'm just trying to learn it on the fly. Yeah.